Today, we gathered here to express our solidarity to the Tibetans in Tibet and in Uyghur who continue to fight for basic freedom, dignity, and identity. Our gathering here in just concluded Tibetan Peace March sends a very strong and clear message to China that Tibetan will not give up and Tibetan will not be bogged down until Tibet issue is resolved and His Holiness the Dalai Lama returns back to Tibet. 64 years ago, in 1949, Chinese Communist People's Liberation Army launched a full-scale military invasion of Tibet under the banner of peaceful liberation. According to International Commission of Jurists report in 1960, Tibet enjoyed a de facto independent status under international law prior to Chinese invasion. Since the occupation, the Chinese government unleashed a series of coercive and repressive campaigns under different forms and names with the primary objective of sinicization of Tibet. Despite all those onslaughts, the Tibetan spirit and Tibetan people's faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama has remained unshaken and unbroken for 3 generations. Today in Tibet, four big things are happening, along with the political repression, human rights violations that we hear and see on alternate days. First, demographic aggression. China is engaged in the aggressive demographic transformation of Tibet by flooding in the Han Chinese into Tibet. This is part of a grand design to marginalize and assimilate Tibetan people like they did to Manchurian and the Inner Mongolian people. Second, the culture genocide. China has imported the Chinese language as the medium of instruction in educational institutions and clamped down and regulated the monasteries in line with the party ideology. The campaign of patriotic education is going on in Tibet. Tibetan language is not an officially employed language in Tibetan areas. Third, nomads resettlement. Nomads are being forcefully resettled in housing blocks called socialist village with no prospects of education, health, economic incentives, despite UN Special Rapporteur calling for a meaningful consultation. Fourth, environmental destruction. Environmental destruction by excessive mining of Tibetan resources and damming on rivers without the due process of consultation and blatant disregard for environmental concern. As of 2012, there are around thousands of known cases of political prisoners in Tibet. There are no basic human rights and freedoms in Tibet. On 24th June 2012, a 17-year-old Jigme Doma made a lone peaceful protest in Kangse County, eastern Tibet, while shouting for the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the release of political prisoners. 5 minutes later, Chinese authorities arrested and beat her before being taken to jail. She was tortured and denied the family visitation rights and lawyer despite repeated requests by her families. On 25th August, she was sentenced by Kangse County People's Court to 3 years imprisonment just for shouting, "Return for His Holiness and Tibetan freedom." She was charged on the so-called splittist activity. The Chinese authorities took her to prison in China and nobody knows of her whereabouts. Since 2009, 121 Tibetans have committed self-immolations. His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration have always discouraged such drastic action. However, it persists. The universal demand of the self-immolator is the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan freedom. This has been the main aspiration of Tibetan people inside and outside Tibet. Today, China's human rights record is being reviewed under the UPR mechanism. And 3 weeks from now, Chinese Human Rights Council membership election will come up for voting in UN. Last year, United Nations Human Rights Commissioner Madam Pillay has urged Chinese government to promptly address the long-standing grievances that had led to an alarming escalation in desperate form of protests, including self-immolation in Tibetan areas. Instead of reviewing and investigating the cause of these drastic actions, Chinese regime continues to ignore the international community calls. On the contrary, they have strengthened the repressive policies in Tibet. Lately, Nagchu counting shooting of the Tibetan protesters who refused to fly the Chinese red flags is a case in point. China has so far refused to respond to 13 outstanding requests by the officials of the UN High Commissioner and special rapporteurs on various human rights issues in Tibet. Therefore, the member states and the international community must not shy away from their core human rights obligation. Economic interests and the political expediency should not be the deterrents to raise the right issues. Stay away with the authoritarian regime. The policy of appeasement and the trade-off with your own narrow interests will harm the overall promotion and protection of human rights. It's time member states talk tough with China and stand up for their values. People's desire for freedom and justice cannot be shut for too long. History has shown that authoritarian and undemocratic government did not last long. Therefore, we Tibetans cannot be complacent in our endeavor, and with truth on our side and the dynamic leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration, and with the support of international community, Tibetan Day will surely come. Thank you again for coming here. I want to thank the international supporters who spoke just before me. Thank you so much.
With regard to human rights, these fingerprints place China at the scene of so many activities that so outside normal civilized nations that its membership on the United Nations Human Rights Council defies logic, reason, and common sense. To put simply, a country's qualification for the Human Rights Council is based on how it treats its own people and based on how it promotes human rights of other peoples around the world. In considering China's human rights record, we need look no further than the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Uyghur groups who received unspeakable suffering at the hand of the Chinese regime. In considering Chinese human rights record, we need look no further than these individuals, groups, policies, events. Tiananmen massacre, Tiananmen mothers, March 14th incidents in Lhasa, July 5th incidents in Urumqi. Liu Xiaobo and his wife Liu Xia, Wang Bingzhang, Dangdup Wangchen, Harriet Nayez, Hada, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, forced abortions, forced evictions, forced disappearance, black jails. Today, we come here to declare it is wrong to allow China, the world human rights violator, leading violator, to sit on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Surely, a Human Rights Council member must subscribe to the Universal Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Subscribe in practice, in principle. But in China, Chinese government has continued to fail the minimal test I proposed a few years ago. This document, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, cannot be freely distributed in China. Can you distribute Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Lhasa or in Urumqi? No, we cannot. So China is not qualified to be a member. Nearly a quarter century has passed ever since Tiananmen Square massacre. Yet, Chinese government continue to refuse to admit any wrongdoing. It continues to repress any individuals, groups who try to expose the truth and commemorate the victims. The government that massacres its own citizens at the heart of its capital is the same government that continues to routinely imprison, torture, and exile its best citizens for no other reason than exercising their freedom of speech. This is the same government who pursues cultural genocide on Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians. This is the same government who pursue a religious purge on Christians, Falun Gongs, Muslims, and Tibetan Buddhists. This is the same government, its foreign policy and model of repression that enable the morally bankrupt regimes of North Korea, Iran, and Syria to suck the freedom and dignity from their own people. Chinese government disdain for human rights, for human dignity, now openly challenge the foundation of civilization itself. So we must act as one force opposed Chinese government. So we come here in solidarity. We come here to wage a war against the dictatorship in United Nations by us, the people. So we are the people who dare to wage the war against the dictatorship in United States. Thank you very much. Freedom for all. Human rights for Tibetans. Human rights for Uyghurs. Human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.